You saw the headlines. The meeting that was supposed to change everything, the Trump-Putin summit in Budapest, is off indefinitely. The Kremlin just slammed the door shut, refusing to even set a date for a ceasefire. So what happened behind the scenes? Why did this critical diplomatic push, coordinated by none other than Hungary's Viktor Orbán, collapse at the last minute? And what does this tell us about the real state of this war? A conflict that continues to reshape Europe. Today we're going beyond the news cycle. We're dissecting the collapse of this summit piece by piece. We'll expose the non-negotiable demands from Moscow that made a deal impossible. We'll break down the dangerous game of chicken now being played between the Kremlin and Western capitals, and we'll reveal the shocking reality of what a frozen conflict actually means for Ukraine and for global security. Stick around until the end, because I'm going to show you the one major calculation the Kremlin is making that could decide the fate of this war for years to come, a gamble that most Western analysts are completely overlooking. The official reason for the delay, straight from the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, is a rejection of what he called artificial deadlines and one-sided conditions from the West. He stated clearly that Russia is ready for dialogue, but only on terms that respect their, and I quote, legitimate security interests and the realities on the ground. Now let's translate that from diplomatic speak into plain English. Realities on the ground is the key phrase here. It's a euphemism. It means the vast tracts of Ukrainian land that the Russian military currently occupies. Moscow isn't just asking for a ceasefire, it's demanding that any negotiations start from a baseline that recognizes its territorial gains. It wants the front line, as it exists today, to be the new de facto border for talks. Think about that for a second. After years of brutal warfare, after cities like Mariupol were reduced to rubble, after alleged war crimes and a campaign of terror, Russia's opening position is that its conquest must be acknowledged as a starting point. This isn't a minor detail, it's the entire ballgame. From the perspective of Kiev and its Western allies, accepting this premise is tantamount to surrendering. It would mean rewarding military aggression. It would legitimize the violation of a sovereign nation's borders. This is the fundamental chasm that no amount of back-channel diplomacy, even through a figure like Orbán, could bridge. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, stated it bluntly after the postponement. We cannot legitimize aggression by freezing it. That phrase is crucial. Legitimizing aggression by freezing it. A ceasefire that solidifies Russia's hold on Ukrainian territory isn't a peace deal. It's a pause that allows the aggressor to consolidate its spoils. It creates a frozen conflict, much like what we've seen in other parts of the former Soviet Union for decades. These are conflicts that are never truly resolved. They are just put on ice, serving as permanent leverage for Moscow, creating constant instability and suffering for the local population. For Ukraine, this is an existential red line. President Zelensky himself said it. Peace cannot be built on concessions to the aggressor. It must be built on justice. But let's flip the perspective and look at it from the Kremlin's point of view. Why would they make such a maximalist demand, knowing it would likely torpedo the talks? Is it simply arrogance, or is there a deeper strategy at play? Many analysts, including former White House Russia advisor Fiona Hill, point to the maximalist positions both sides are holding. But for Russia, this isn't just a negotiating tactic, it's a core part of their wartime narrative. They have invested enormous political and propaganda capital in claiming that these occupied regions have chosen to be with Russia, despite the widely condemned and illegal referendums. To back down from that now would be a massive internal political defeat for Putin. Furthermore, by rejecting the summit, Moscow sends a powerful message to the West: your pressure doesn't work. Sanctions, threats, diplomatic isolation, the Kremlin is portraying all of it as irrelevant. Russian state media is already spinning this delay as proof that the West has no real interest in a compromise. It's a performance of strength aimed as much at a domestic audience as it is at the international community. It says, we are not desperate, we will not be dictated to. But behind this bold facade, there are signs of calculation. The costs of this war for Russia are immense. From a military that has suffered significant losses to an economy straining under the weight of sanctions, the Kremlin is likely betting that Western resolve, particularly in Europe, will crack before theirs does. And this brings us to the first major hook in this entire saga. Because while the diplomats were talking about summits, the fighting on the ground didn't stop. In fact, it intensified. Ukrainian forces have reported a sharp increase in shelling along the eastern front. Russia has continued its missile campaigns targeting critical infrastructure. This is not a coincidence. The collapse of diplomacy often signals an escalation on the battlefield. One side or both sides try to improve their negotiating position by creating new realities on the ground. They try to capture more territory, to inflict more pain, to prove that time is on their side. So as the doors to the negotiating room closed, the guns on the front lines got louder. This is the brutal logic of modern warfare. But the real shocker, the thing that most people are missing, is what happens next if this stalemate continues. And trust me, that's where this story gets even more dangerous. Stay with me, because the postponement of this summit isn't just a diplomatic failure, it's a massive test of Western unity. And the cracks are already starting to show. European diplomats are privately admitting that without a credible diplomatic process on the horizon, it becomes incredibly difficult to maintain the consensus needed to continue massive military and financial support for Ukraine. Ukraine. There's something called donor fatigue, and it's a very real political force. Citizens in supporting nations start to ask, how long does this go on? How much of our money is being sent? When does it end? An official from a northern European country involved in aid coordination put it starkly. There's a growing sense that something has to give. Either diplomacy advances or support begins to fray. Let that sink in. The very foundation of Ukraine's ability to resist, the steady flow of weapons, ammunition, and economic aid, is directly tied to the political will in Washington and European capitals. And that political will is not infinite. The Kremlin knows this. Their entire long-term strategy might be to simply wait the West out, to grind down Ukraine through attrition, and to grind down Western public opinion through a war of exhaustion. This creates an impossible dilemma for Western policymakers. How do you pursue peace without betraying the principle that aggression cannot be rewarded? If you push Ukraine to negotiate from a position of weakness, you shatter the entire post-World War II international order based on sovereignty. But if you continue an open-ended commitment to a long war of attrition, you risk political fragmentation at home and an even greater humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine. There is no good answer. This is the fragile balance that the failed Budapest summit has exposed for the entire world to see. And this is where the situation gets truly provocative. Because for the United States, and specifically for the incoming Trump administration, this delay is a significant early setback. President-elect Trump had openly positioned himself as the dealmaker, the one who could end this war where others had failed. He welcomed the idea of face-to-face talks with Putin. The cancellation just weeks before his inauguration undermines that narrative. It reveals the profound depth of mistrust and the hard geopolitical limits that even an American president faces. The message from Moscow was clear. We are not desperate for your deal. We will talk, but only if you come to us on our terms. So, what are the real terms that Moscow is insisting on? We've talked about the realities on the ground, but let's be even more specific. It's not just about land. It's about the fundamental rewriting of the security architecture in Europe. Russia wants guarantees that NATO will not expand further, that its influence in what it considers its sphere of influence will be recognized. The war in Ukraine is the violent enforcement of that doctrine. To accept a ceasefire that locks in their territorial gains is the first step toward accepting their broader geopolitical vision. This isn't just about Donbass or Crimea. This is about whether might makes right in the 21st century. And this is the core reason why a simple deal, a quick handshake between leaders, was always a fantasy. The stakes are simply too high. Now you might be thinking, what's the way out? Is this just a hopeless spiral into more violence? Well, that brings me to the thing I promised you at the start. The one major calculation the Kremlin is making that everyone is underestimating. It's not just about waiting out Western resolve. It's about a fundamental belief that the global world order is shifting. Moscow is betting that the global south, countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, are either sympathetic to its position or, more importantly, simply don't care enough to actively oppose it. They are calculating that as the world becomes more multipolar, the condemnation from the United States and Europe will matter less and less. They are looking at their growing economic and military ties with China, and they are deciding that they can withstand the pressure. They are playing a longer, more dangerous game, believing that time and global tectonic shifts are on their side. This is the real poker hand being played, and the Budapest summit was just one revealed card. So we've established the core problem. The summit collapsed because Russia demanded that its conquered territories be the starting point for any talks, a condition the West simply could not accept. But to truly understand why this deadlock is so dangerous, we need to look at what's happening away from the negotiating table. Because while diplomats were packing their bags in Budapest, the war on the ground entered a new and even more brutal phase. In the days immediately following the announcement of the delay, Ukrainian military officials reported a significant intensification of Russian offensive operations across the entire eastern front. We're not just talking about a few more artillery shells. We're talking about coordinated assaults, increased use of glide bombs, and waves of infantry attacks. The towns of Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka, already symbols of this war's ferocity, became epicenters of a renewed storm of steel and fire. This is not a coincidence. It's a deliberate strategy. When diplomacy fails, violence often speaks louder. The Kremlin is sending an unambiguous message. If you will not give us what we want at the table, we will take more of it on the battlefield. Every village they capture, every tactical advance they make, strengthens their bargaining position for the next time talks are suggested. They are creating new realities on the ground to make their initial demands seem more reasonable by comparison. Think about it. If they can push the front line another 10, 20, 50 kilometers west, then their demand to negotiate from the current front line suddenly becomes a more pressing issue for Ukraine, which would be staring at the loss of even more of its sovereign territory. But it's not just about territory. The other key part of this pressure campaign is the continued systematic targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, power grids, heating plants, railway hubs. These attacks are designed to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people, and just as importantly, to dramatically increase the cost for Europe. A Ukraine without power in the dead of winter creates a massive refugee pressure on its western neighbors. It strains the humanitarian aid system to its breaking point. It makes the prospect of a long, drawn-out war seem unbearable for everyone involved. involved. This is a classic tactic of siege warfare, applied on a national scale. And let's talk about the Western response, because here is where the situation gets even more precarious. The postponement of the summit has exposed a growing and potentially fatal divide within the alliance supporting Ukraine. Publicly, everyone is saying the right things. The White House stated it's not walking away from diplomacy, but won't accept a deal that legitimizes aggression. European leaders like Josep Borrell echo the same sentiment. But behind the scenes, the unity is fraying. In capitals like Berlin, Paris, and Rome, there are quiet but increasingly audible voices questioning the long-term sustainability of this support. The cost is staggering. Billions of euros and dollars have been spent, weapon stocks are depleted, and domestic populations are growing weary. Farmers in Poland are blocking borders in protest, truckers are angry about Ukrainian competition, and far-right parties across Europe are gaining traction by campaigning on a platform of ending aid to Ukraine. The political foundation upon which this entire support structure is built is beginning to erode. The Kremlin's propagandists are, of course, amplifying this message every single day. Their narrative is simple. The West is tired, the West is divided, they cannot keep this up forever. We can. And with every week that passes without a diplomatic breakthrough, that narrative gains a little more credibility. An official from a northern European country involved in aid coordination told Reuters, and this is a direct quote, "There's a growing sense that something has to give. Either diplomacy advances or support begins to fray. We are now at the point where something has to give." This creates an impossible dilemma for Ukraine. How do you fight a war when your primary source of ammunition and funding is becoming politically unstable? How do you plan a counter-offensive when you're not sure if the necessary weapons will arrive in 6 months? This uncertainty is a weapon in itself, perhaps one of Russia's most powerful at this stage. And this brings us to the second major hook I promised you. Because while everyone is focused on the front lines in Donbass, there's a different kind of war being waged. A war in the shadows, a war of economic endurance, of political subversion, and of information manipulation. And it's in this shadow war that the next chapter of this conflict will likely be decided. What we see with tanks and artillery is just the tip of the spear. The real battle is happening in the boardrooms of multinational corporations, in the halls of power in European capitals, and in the news feeds of social media users around the world. And what's happening there is even more shocking than the collapse of the Budapest summit. Stay with me, because this is where we separate the headlines from the real game. Let's talk about this shadow war. We've discussed the military pressure and the political fatigue, but there's a third, more insidious front that Russia has opened, the economic and informational front. And their strategy here is brilliantly cynical. They are actively working to make supporting Ukraine as painful as possible for the average European and American citizen. How? Let's start with energy. While Europe has made heroic efforts to wean itself off Russian gas and oil, the Kremlin still has levers to pull. By manipulating global energy prices through production cuts in alliance with OPEC Plus nations, they can keep inflation high in the West. When people in Germany or France open their heating bills or pay for gasoline, that financial pain creates political pressure. It leads to protests, it fuels discontent with incumbent governments, and it strengthens political parties that promise to end the costly support for Ukraine. This isn't an accident, it's a calculated form of economic warfare. Then there's the information war. Russian state-sponsored media and a vast network of online trolls and bots work tirelessly to spread a few key messages. One, that the war is a proxy conflict between NATO and Russia, making Ukraine seem like a pawn rather than a sovereign victim. 2, that the Ukrainian government is corrupt and undeserving of aid. And 3, that peace could be achieved tomorrow if only the West stopped supplying weapons. These messages are tailored for different audiences. In the West, they aim to sow doubt and apathy. In the global South, they aim to portray Russia as a nation standing up to Western hegemony, gaining sympathy and breaking down the united front of international sanctions. And let's be honest, this campaign is having an effect. We see it in the shifting opinions in some African and South American nations who blame Western sanctions for food and energy shortages rather than Russian aggression. We see it in the comment sections of Western news outlets filled with cynical questions about wasting tax dollars on a foreign war. The goal is to isolate Ukraine diplomatically and to strangle its support system slowly, like tightening a noose. Now let's pivot to the United States, because the political dynamics there are perhaps the most volatile of all. The incoming Trump administration faces a monumental test right out of the gate. The president-elect had built a part of his political brand on being the ultimate dealmaker, the man who could solve intractable problems. The very public collapse of his planned summit with Putin is a stark reminder that some problems are immune to sheer force of personality. The dilemma for the new administration is profound. Does it double down on military support to try and force Russia to negotiate from a weaker position? This would mean convincing a skeptical Congress to approve yet another massive aid package, a task that is becoming politically more difficult by the day. Or does it lean into its instinct for a deal and begin to pressure Ukraine to make territorial concessions for the sake of ending the war? This second path would cause a catastrophic rift with European allies and would be seen by many as a historic betrayal, effectively rewarding aggression and signaling to other authoritarian regimes that borders can be redrawn by force. There are whispers, and they are only whispers at this point, that some advisors in the incoming administration might be flirting with a controversial idea, a Korea-like scenario for Ukraine, a formalized division of the country, a democratic Western-leaning Ukraine in the west, and a Russian-controlled puppet state in the east and south, separated by a heavily fortified demilitarized zone. From a purely cold, realist perspective, it would freeze the conflict and stop the immediate bleeding, but it would also mean abandoning millions of Ukrainians to live under a brutal occupation. It would legitimize the concept of spheres of influence over the principle of sovereignty, and it would create a permanent, festering wound in the heart of Europe, a constant source of tension and a potential flashpoint for a future, even larger war. This is the unthinkable option that is now being thought about in some foreign policy circles. The failure of the Budapest summit has made previously taboo ideas seem suddenly plausible. This is how wars evolve. When diplomacy hits a wall, previously unacceptable solutions begin to creep into the conversation. And this leads us directly to the peak of our analysis, the shocking reality that is becoming impossible to ignore. So we've seen the battlefield escalation, the political fractures in the West, and the insidious shadow war. All of this sets the stage for what comes next, and this is where we move from analysis to a truly uncomfortable and, for many, a shocking prediction. The collapse of the Trump-Putin summit isn't just a temporary setback, it is likely the definitive end of the first phase of this war, the phase where anyone believed a quick, clean, negotiated peace was possible. We are now entering phase 2, the long grind, and this new phase looks terrifyingly familiar to students of history. Let's be brutally honest, the idea that either side is currently willing to compromise on their core demands is a fantasy. For Ukraine, the core demand is the restoration of its territorial integrity and sovereignty. For Russia, it is the formal recognition of its territorial gains and a fundamental change in Europe's security architecture. These are mutually exclusive goals. They cannot be reconciled. There is no middle ground where Ukraine gets its land back and Russia gets to claim victory. This is a zero-sum game. Therefore, the only logical outcome for the foreseeable future is continued war. A war of attrition, a grueling, bloody, exhausting grind that will be measured not in spectacular breakthroughs, but in small villages captured and lost in artillery shell counts and in body bags. This is the reality that the diplomatic failure in Budapest has cemented. The door to a short war is now closed. The era of the long war has begun. And in a long war, advantages shift. The initial importance of high-tech Western weaponry, while still crucial, is balanced by other factors: industrial capacity, manpower, and sheer political will. This is Russia's bet. They are betting that their ability to produce shells, tanks, and missiles in massive Soviet-era quantities will eventually overwhelm Ukraine's reliance on a sometimes slow and politically fraught supply chain from the West. They are mobilizing their economy for a long conflict. They are accepting a lower quality of life for their population in exchange for military output. The question for the West is, can we and will we match that? Can democratic societies, with their changing governments, public opinion shifts, and budget debates, possibly keep pace with a militarized authoritarian state that suppresses dissent and prioritizes the war above all else? This is the central question of the next year. It's not a question of tactics, but of endurance. The Kremlin is counting on our attention spans to be short, our wallets to be shallow, and our political unity to be fragile. This brings us to the peak of our analysis, the single most important and overlooked consequence of this entire situation. Pay close attention, because this is the piece that ties everything together. The real target of Russia's strategy is no longer just the Ukrainian military on the front lines. The ultimate target, and has been for some time, is the political consensus in the United States. Think about it. Without American leadership, without American weapons, without American financial power, the European support for Ukraine becomes disjointed, insufficient, and ultimately unsustainable. The Kremlin understands that the center of gravity for the entire Ukrainian defense effort is located not in Kiev, but in Washington, D.C. Their entire strategy, the escalation on the front, the energy blackmail, the information warfare, is designed to achieve one overriding objective: to force a change in American policy. They are waiting for the moment when a future US administration, perhaps the incoming one, perhaps a subsequent one, looks at the cost and the political turmoil and decides that this war is no longer in America's interest. They are betting on American isolationism. They are betting that the United States will eventually tire of its role as global policeman, especially when the policing is so expensive and has no clear end in sight. This is the grand gamble. This is why they can afford to be so intransigent in negotiations. They believe that time, in the long run, is on their side because the American political system cannot maintain focus on a single foreign policy issue for years on end. They are replaying a version of the Cold War, but this time they believe the West is softer, more divided, and more easily distracted. So, when you see the headlines about the stalled summit, understand that you are not just looking at a failed diplomatic meeting, you are looking at a deliberate strategic choice by the Kremlin to bypass diplomacy altogether